Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, depending on what time zone you're in. My name is Misha Apeltova, and I am a teaching fellow in the social sciences at the University of Chicago, and I am a co-organizer of this event, along with Roy Kimmy, who is a doctoral candidate in history at the University of Chicago. And we're both delighted to welcome you at this event. So today is the second of a series of 3 workshops that collectively analyze the rise of anti-gender and anti-LGBTQ movements as a global social and political phenomenon. Today's event, entitled Pedagogies of Populism and Anti-Gender Politics in Central and Eastern Europe, will discuss different disciplinary and methodological approaches to teaching and engaging students on the topic of gender history and politics in Central and Eastern Europe. We believe that this conversation on pedagogy, pedagogical strategies, teaching is both timely and important, and we are really hoping for a lively discussion with our panelists and all of you on Zoom. We'd like to encourage you to mark your calendars for the 3rd and final event of the series. It will be a day-long hybrid conference to be held at the University of Chicago on October 28th this year. The conference will bring in additional global dimension to the series. Our invited speakers will offer a comparative analysis of anti-gender and anti-LGBTQ movements across different geographical regions. And so far we have confirmed speakers that will speak about the US, France, Poland, Brazil, South Korea, and we're looking for other regions to add to the conference as well. While shifting in scale, we will continue to consider the entanglement of legal advocacy, resource sharing, or populist politics that makes these movements such a powerful and unevenly coordinated global force today. A brief thank you to our sponsors. This series of events would not be possible without the generous support of the Center for East European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the University of Chicago. In particular, its director, Esther Peters, whose enthusiasm and organizing skills are absolutely unparalleled. And we're also here due to the support from the Title VI National Resource Center grants from the US Department of Education. And our thanks further extend to the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality, the Posen Family Center for Human Rights, the Department of History, the Center for Latin American Studies, and the Transnational Approaches to Modern Europe workshop at the University of Chicago. Now, so first, our panelists. I guess I'm moving on to a little bit about the structure of today's event. So first, our panelists, whom I will introduce shortly, will each share their experiences in teaching gender and sexuality in the region. And then Zara, who serves as the moderator today, will ask our panelists further questions, after which we will open it up to you on Zoom and we'll welcome questions, comments, and suggestions from you. We encourage you to type your questions in the chat, especially during the presentations, or raise your hand afterwards to ask your question directly. And also, please feel free to use the chat window to add any material, primary sources, secondary sources, available data sets, favorite podcasts. The goal is to create a repository of pedagogically useful material that any of us can use when constructing syllabi or for any other purpose. We'll compile these suggestions and share them with you after the event. So now let me introduce our distinguished panelists in the order in which they will speak, and I will introduce them all because their presentations, introductory presentations, will be rather short, so as not to interrupt the flow. So first, Maria Bukur is John W. Hill Chair of East European History and Professor at the Department of History at Indiana University. Professor Bukur's work focuses on social and cultural developments in Eastern Europe, with a special emphasis on gender history and the history of Romania. She's author of numerous publications, including several books on topics ranging from eugenics, memory culture and modernism, to the history of 20th century Europe through the lens of gender. Her most recent monograph, entitled The Nation's Gratitude, World War I and Citizenship Rights in Interwar Romania, which came out of Routledge, I believe on the last day of December in 2021, examines the history of veterans' rights in Romania and the ways in which veterans, widows, and orphans responded to and used state policies to shape citizenship practices. Her current research project focuses on the history of disability in Eastern Europe. Now, Professor Bucur taught a range of courses relevant to our topic, and she will give us an overview of the wide range of them in her presentation. Professor Janet Johnson is professor of political science at Brooklyn College, City University of New York. Her work focuses on gender, violence, civil society, and public policy, especially in Russia and other post-communist societies. She is, too, author of several books and more than a dozen articles and book chapters, including recently, The Gender of Informal Politics. The book examines the less visible structures that keep women from achieving their goals in contemporary society, comparing Russia and Iceland. Along with Katalin Fabian and Mara Lazda, she's also a co-editor of a book that takes stock of the current state of the field of gender in Central and Eastern Europe, the Routledge, Handbook of Gender in Central and Eastern Europe and Eurasia, which came out this year, and it's fantastic. So please check it out if you haven't seen it yet. In addition to her academic texts, Professor Johnson has also written for The Nation and online for the Washington Post's Monkey Cage, Boston Review, and The New Yorker. She was the principal investigator for Brooklyn's College Human Rights in Iran, Impact Iran from 2016 and 2019. And she recently served on the executive committee of the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and coordinates a monthly workshop on gender and transformation in Central Eastern Europe and Eurasia. Our third speaker, Alžběta Korochuk, is Associate Professor of Sociology at Södertörn University in Sweden and at the American Studies Center at the University of Warsaw. In addition to her academic work, she is an activist and frequent commenter on human rights and women's rights. Professor Korochuk has conducted research on civil society and social movements, parental activism, and the social and legal implications of assisted reproduction in Poland, as well as conservative mobilization targeting gender equality and feminism. A partial list of her most recent publications includes Rebellious Parents, Parental Movement in Central Eastern Europe and Russia, and co-edited with Katalin Fabian, Civil Society Revisited Lessons from Poland. I'm sorry. The Rebellious Parents was co-edited with Katalin Fabian. Now, very much relevant for today's workshop is the recent monograph that Professor Korochuk wrote with Agnieszka Graf, Anti-Gender Politics in the Populist Movement, which analyzes how opposition to the concept of gender has, since 2010, come to act as a key component in right-wing populist politics and discourses. Professor Korochuk is a member of numerous research networks on gender politics in Europe. As just one example, a project led by Jenny Gunnarsson Payne titled Reproducing Injustice towards a relational theory of reproductive justice of surrogacy in Baltic, Central, and Eastern Europe. And finally, our moderator for today, Zara. Professor Zara is the Homer J. Livingston Professor of East European History and the College at the University of Chicago. Her research focuses on transnational history of modern Europe, migration, the family, nationalism, and humanitarianism, and anti-globalism. Professor Zara is author of a number of books and publications, most recently, The Great Departure, Mass Migration and the Making of the Free World, and with Leora Auslander, Objects of War, the Material Culture of Conflict and Displacement. Excitingly, her new book, Against the World, Anti-Globalism and Mass Politics Between the World Wars, will be coming out soon. Mark your calendars and watch out for the publication. In 2014, Zara received a MacArthur grant, and in 2021 was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship. She was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2019 and was recently appointed Roman Family Director of the Neubauer Collegium for Culture and Society at the University of Chicago. So with that, I'll give the floor to our distinguished panelists, and I'm excited for the presentations and the discussion.
Thank you, Misha. I'm going to just quickly share my screen. I hope everybody can see it. Yes. Does that work? Fantastic. All right. So I have 10 minutes and I have quite a few things to say. I'm starting with a bit of shameless self-advertising here, because this is a book that engages with anti-genderism for an audience of undergraduate students at the kind of freshman and sophomore level of thinking about the history of the 20th century from a feminist perspective. So if there's one that I would recommend in terms of teaching people who are not familiar with Eastern Europe in a larger context, this is the one book that I've used and students respond to it. Before I get into the specifics of the questions that we were asked to address, I need to describe my audience. And I think looking at my co-panelists, we have very different audiences, in fact. And so it's important to think about, you know, what the room is like when you walk into it and are teaching about these issues. I've been teaching at Indiana University since 1996. It's the only place that I've taught regularly. I mean, I do guest appearances in other places. So Indiana University, as far as the undergraduates are concerned, is although in the Midwest, very much of the Southern kind of political persuasion, it has voted Republican very solidly for a very long time. The students kind of reflect that. It's super white. And in the history department where I started, the vast majority of the majors and the people taking classes are male and white. This is a departure. Well, it's sort of doesn't fit the overall body of the student, which tilts more female, and it's not quite as white. So in the history department, that's the kind of issues, the population in front of me. And I've also been teaching in gender studies since 2015, where the population is primarily cis female, although there's a rising, I would say, percentage of queer population. And it's more diverse in terms of self-identification with a variety of ethnic and racial identities. So these are two different kinds of populations that I'm working with. All right, we were asked to address a number of questions. So the questions at the top of my slides are the questions we were asked to talk about. And I will go quickly through the kinds of courses and approaches that I've had. So I've taught since 2015, basically all my courses deal with gender and sexuality in some format. And in all my courses, I actually engage with Eastern Europe because it's one of the cases that I know very well. I have primarily courses that do not focus just on Eastern Europe. And the students are very much not familiar with anything about Eastern Europe historically or culturally in the present. And so talking about these topics that we're asked to think about, populism, anti-gender, anti-LGBTQ movements, gives me a chance to familiarize them with both the context of Eastern Europe, especially in the 20th century, but also to integrate these kinds of issues with larger transnational things that I also talk about in those classes. So let me just go quickly through the courses that I've been teaching regularly. This Global History of Women in the 20th Century survey uses that book that I showed you in the previous slide. And it's organized thematically, although it kind of works chronologically as well. And in the very last section, which is about the last 3 weeks of the class, we deal with kind of sort of 21st century history, very recent history. And the focus in my teaching is on this notion that kinship has really changed in the way that people practice forms of kinship formation and the way that they think about their identities in relationship to their families and to kinship. and that in fact, anti-gender politics is a very important component of reactions against alternative kinship formations in the United States, but also across the world. So I bring into discussion, as I say here, the cases of Poland, for instance, and Russia, but also Germany. I talk about Gabriele Kubi there and about, you know, her ways of understanding queer politics and the so-called sexual revolution that she talks about in very, you know, negative terms, basically, to get the students to think about the ways in which they themselves are interacting with these kinds of discourses. I teach very regularly a course on transnational feminism for gender studies. It's a upper division course, and it's based on some discussions of theoretical and case studies around the world. We have a module in that class that focuses on anti-gender. What I like to do with that group of students, most of whom know nothing about Eastern Europe, is to place a discussion about Eastern Europe in conversation with anti-gender turf type of feminist movements in the UK, which they're much more familiar with because of J.K. Rowling and other, you know, famous people who are interacting with that. And so in that class, I teach Elżbieta, you like to know, your analyses together with Agnieszka, the Ebola article that's part of your book, as well as a few other kind of larger theoretical approaches to anti-gender, and that places the Polish case in particular in that context, that comparative context. So that gives students purchase into understanding the specificities, but also thinking through sort of what sort of agents, what sort of political alliances, but also what sorts of rhetoric is being used and for what purposes in these different contexts to kind of challenge, especially in that case, any kind of notions that students might have about Eastern Europe as being backwards or as being somehow other than other places that they're more familiar with. It's a very intentional way of getting them to think about basically the kind of challenges to post-binary thinking about gender from these perspectives, right? And so we talk about the rhetoric around gender ideology, for instance, and what that means and what sort of agents are using it and what for purposes, from religious to kind of intellectual feminists that are, you know, liberal white feminists like J.K. Rowling's. So that's that. I'm going to move through because I know we only have 10 minutes. I have the variety courses of Eastern Europe that I'm teaching, where I bring anti-gender in there is to talk about what's happening in Eastern Europe since 1989 and to place the revival of religious institutions after the end of communism in conversation with these larger transnational trends that you know, are talked about in the literature and anti-gender, and that have to do with the Orthodox Church in particular and how it's evolved in Russia, in Romania, in also Ukraine, by the way. It's not that different, in fact. So that's kind of where that goes. I have taught some graduate courses that also engage with this more specifically, and they're the conversation's a little different. So I've taught a course on Marxism and gender. And when we engage with the discussion about gender emancipation under communism and what's happened since post-communism, I bring in anti-gender as a component of thinking through the legacies of these Marxist regimes. I'm generally very critical of the literature that praises emancipatory sort of views of Eastern Europe and women under communism. I think I'm an outlier, but that's where I stand, and I can say more about it later. And most recently, I've taught a course on the radical right and gender in Europe, which I taught because of Elżbieta and Agnieszka's book that had just come out, and I absolutely loved it. So, big plug here for that book. And I thought I should build a course around it because there's quite a bit that's come out in the last 5 years around these issues. So I also taught the Rebellious Parents book in that course, and had Kati, who I know is here in the room, as one of our guests. In that course, what I've done is try to place in conversation the current kind of populist moment that we're talking about and the anti-gender rhetoric in relation to historical legacies that have to do with both fascist and Nazi sort of discourses about gender and sexuality, but also the kind of broader issue of basically late, colonialism and post-colonialism in Europe in relation to concepts of gender that then get picked up and somehow resurface after the end of communism. So I'm making an argument there about some continuities in this anti-gender rhetoric that I don't see as being quite as new as might be thought of at first glance. And I do teach a class on gender violence, in which there's a module on anti-gender, where the discussion is both about what's happening in places like Poland, for instance, but also what's happening in Chechnya in relation to gay rights. So, and in that context, we're talking about also the Istanbul Convention and the ways in which, for instance, Poland has reacted to the rhetoric of how to define gender there, and generated, I think, a kind of violence in the sense of discursive violence against concepts of gender rights. All right, I don't know how much time I have, but I'm going to keep going, and somebody's going to tell me to shut up at some point. I have highlighted, and if you already listened, kind of what I'm talking about is I've highlighted discourse. The sources that we have in English to work with, I think really are much more accessible in terms of looking through the discourse that's being used and the kind of reinterpretation of rhetoric that might have been feminist at one point, from the perspective of essentializing gender identity and gender norms, and basically challenging or displacing feminist understandings of gender identity and in these discourses. So that's one of the main foci that I use. I've used some images as well in terms of sources. In the Polish case, there's some fantastic images to be used. You have the marches of people who are identifying through images Nazis with feminism, in the LGBT free zones, for instance. And those are very powerful for the students. They really get the point very quickly and enable me to kind of get beyond the shock value and start taking it apart. So I can say more about that later. The other thing I found very useful, and I recommend it to everybody, the Grevio reports from the Istanbul Convention. There are a number of them, and the Polish one just came out not too long ago. I have it highlighted here. It gives you access to what the official representatives of the state say, and then what NGOs and feminist observers say, who in the case of Poland are definitely not the same people. Some of the same kind of tensions appear in other, like if you look at the Turkish one or the Romanian one, you see the same kinds of tensions come up. These are very rich reports, and they're done very seriously. I really highly recommend them for anybody teaching on these topics. All right, lastly, as I've already said, one of the concepts that I really like to play with is the way in which the human rights discourse has been repackaged by these anti-gender folks into an anti-feminist discourse. And so it really forces students to become accountable for their own use of language and for their own kind of sense of ownership of particular concepts and of particular positionalities. It's a kind of displacement that I'm attempting with them rhetorically. It works sometimes. I can't say that it works every time, but it's how I try to push their buttons and their assumptions. I also, I'm a historian, so I can't do any of this without really placing historical context. And going back, as I've already indicated, maybe even to the 19th century to get into how we've gotten here in terms of religious discourse, in terms of citizenship rights discourse, and in terms of feminism itself and how it's evolved. I am very invested in providing a transnational view of these national populist rhetorics. The fact that there's this tension at the heart of anti-gender, rhetoric in which nationalism ranks very high, and the fact that these are international movements very often is something that I think last time that this workshop was happening, Elżbieta and others were talking about, and that's for me very important as well. The other thing that I like to really highlight with all my teaching is the limits of liberal feminism. That's getting very easy with the students. They are very receptive to that. In fact, they're ultra receptive to that. I have to rescue a bit of the concept of liberal feminism with them, but critiquing it is a big part of how we get at this. And as I said, comparative analysis is really how I anchor the discussion about Eastern Europe, because I want them to think about context again in a relational way. Finally, I think that the impact of affect and political mobilization, something that Elżbieta and Agnieszka talk quite a bit in your book, I find that really powerful and really necessary for the period that we are living through in terms of students' own understanding of their positionality and how they learn things and how they consider ideas. And the limits of deconstructivism in developing allyship is a really big part of what I try to work through with the students. People are really good at deconstructing things and critiquing, very good. What happens after you do that, and what kind of alliances one can develop based on learning about these really toxic movements is a real big challenge, and one that I can't say I've mastered, but it is my big goal in teaching pretty much everything in terms of feminist pedagogy. Well, there's a lot of sources. I'm just going to put them here very, very quickly. There's more about anti-gender in Eastern Europe than about feminism in the 20th century. I think what we need more of is primary sources in English that are analyses of these topics. There is a forthcoming forum in the Aspasia yearbook about the l'entente of women and the kind of feminism that developed in Eastern Europe in the interwar period. Fabulous book that I recommend to everybody is Anita Korimai's Queer Book Budapest. It's really phenomenal in terms of getting at difficult questions about how to search about queerness in sources that are not very friendly to understanding queerness, and also periodizing Eastern Europe so that the communist caesura is not a caesura. In fact, it's a very different kind of periodization. Big fan. Another book that came out very recently, Agnieszka Koshanska has two books, but To See a Moose is amazing. She took a bunch of sex ed materials from Polish and writes a history that basically looks at how the evolution of teaching about sexual education has developed in Poland with some fabulous examples, and really kind of gets at how anti-gender developed actually since before the fall of communism in Poland. That's one of the things that becomes very clear when you get through that. What else do we need? More sources from women and queer communities about their experiences under communism and post-communism. Oral histories, community kind of based projects I love to see more of that, that would give us a firsthand account of these experiences. We just don't have enough of it.
Maria, this is really great. We're getting a little bit over time. If you can sort of finish up, before I come back to all this.
Yes, okay. And again, more literary sources and translation from feminist, queer, and gender relations kind of authors. And if anybody is interested, I'm not even going to go through these are things that I've published myself. If you want sources about my work on anti-gender. Thank you, and sorry about being so long.
No worries. Thank you so much. That was really rich and fantastic. We already have so much to discuss. I just wanted to make sure we have time for all the presentations and more discussion. So our next speaker will be Janet, I believe. Great, thanks.
Thanks so much. I I'm going to talk about two sets of questions: why we should talk about and teach about anti-gender movements, and then how we do it. It seems to me that before we even get into the nuts and bolts of how, is why teach about anti-gender movements in Central and Eastern Europe, because Central Eastern Europe is actually a pretty small part of the world, which we need to know in terms of thinking about decolonizing our curriculum. And it's really far from my students. So I went to Indiana. My students are very different. I teach at Brooklyn College in the City University of New York. So I have very diverse students. And there's a large percentage of students who are from the region. It is the largest population of Russian and Ukrainian speakers in the world. So frankly, it's really hard to think about this right now, not just because I still have COVID brain, but also given Russia's war on Ukraine, as well as the US context of racist murders in Buffalo, the impending destruction of women's reproductive rights, and the local politics around teaching tolerance in our schools. But these are, of course, the reasons to teach about the anti-gender movement, because all these things are connected. Anti-gender ideology and the so-called replacement theory, ideology, policy, and state violence. So just specifically, Putin, suffering from lackluster economic performance after the global recession of 2008 to 10, turned increasingly to elites who embraced ultra-conservative anti-gender ideas, but also Eurasianist ideas that justify warmongering. And it seems to me that some elite heteronormative white men, the global north and east, are embracing these ideas in the last gasp of these intersectional power structures. They are not wrong. Feminist and queer ideas in intersection to critiques about race fundamentally challenge these ideas that I see as increasingly connected, not just to right-wing populism, but to fascism, even as they accuse feminist and queer activists and Ukrainians as being fascist. And these ideas took hold especially in Central and Eastern Europe, finding support from entrenched elites and power structures, and are now spreading like COVID, with consequences for policy globally and justifying violence. So let me talk about how we can talk about these things. Let me just share my screen. So how do we teach about this when our fuses are so short from 2+ years of COVID and shared trauma from watching the atrocities in Ukraine? I'm going to talk about existing resources that I've used in the last couple of years, and some of which I helped curate as one of the editors of the 2021 Routledge Handbook on Gender in Central Eastern Europe and Eurasia, which I edited with Cataline Fabian and Mara, who are here, Mara Lazda. And it's a source designed to bring advanced undergraduate and graduate students up to speed really quickly in 5,000-word chapters, outlining the main debates or developments in the scholarship. And I taught these texts as part of a course on gender politics around the world, which is a cross-listed course in political science and gender studies and covers, the whole world. But it's in the section on Central and Eastern Europe. So the way that I do this is I'm just throwing out there a piece that I wrote recently with Valerie Sperling, Alexandra Novitskaya, and Lisa McIntosh Sundstrom, applying sort of these ideas about anti-genderism and how they played out in the war against Ukraine by Russia. So application is really important. But the deeper arguments, I think, but the way that I teach it in the global politics around the world course is to provide a lot of context and then get to the theory. But I want to point out the piece in the handbook that I think is really, really good in a short way of encapsulating the anti-gender mobilization and right-wing populism by Agnieszka Graf. I love the book by Elżbieta and Graf. I also highly recommend it. But this chapter by Graf examines the scholarship on the anti-gender movement's origins and its growth. It talks about the World Congress of Families, which I also talk about in my classes that cover Nigeria because it's had impact globally. And this chapter makes a claim for the alliance with populist parties and why Central and Eastern Europe holds a special position in the anti-gender imaginary and why it's been a strategic target for the movement. But I think it's super important to provide the historical context of the socialist promises which I, like Maria, find problematic, but the socialist promises and practices to emancipate some women, and even some LGBTQ folks, especially outside of the Soviet Union. So I really do like starting with Kristen Godsey's New York Times piece that lays out that puzzle, or using some chapters from her book if I have more time. But I also think it's important to add in these chapters from the handbook. Judith Tkach shows how much socialist countries outside of Romania and outside of the Soviet Union did legalize queerness before it was legalized in the West. And Esther Vars's chapter really introduces the notion of race, because I think we have to I think we need to add in race to our discussions of anti-genderism in ways that we haven't necessarily done. And Varsa shows that if you look from the perspective of the Roma, you find a very different sense of the general wisdom, for example, that after Stalin, there was progressiveness towards reproductive rights, because the legalization of abortion. Roma women had a very different experience of this. I also think it's important to throw in colonial critiques to provide the context for thinking about anti-genderism. And there's a chapter by Tatiana Zhurko and Jennifer Suchlin, which does a very explicit application of decolonial or post-colonial approaches to thinking about Central and Eastern Europe. It's mostly focused on the Caucasus and Central Asia. But the chapter, oops, this is why I don't always, there we go. Alexandra Herzog's chapter is about the post-Soviet period, but she makes this argument that seems remarkably prescient about the ways in which the Soviet and post-Soviet Russia, the role of Soviet and post-Soviet Russia has played in undermining gender equality progress in post-Soviet Ukraine. And I think it's also important to put our discussion about anti-genderism in the context of Western feminist intervention and the debates about all these issues within gender studies of the region. And I highly recommend this chapter by Eva Maria Hinterhuber and Gesine Fuchs, which outlines these major debates within the literature about the ability to intervene as Western feminists, but also what happened with Western funding, and also these debates that Godsey really has helped us frame around whether communism was good or bad for women. Jill Irvine's chapter looks specifically at the question of what happens with the funding. And then Cataline and Mara and I have an article that just came out in the Russian Review that takes these arguments about whether the transition helped improve the lot of women straight on, and makes an argument about intentional ambiguity as an important way of thinking about these things. And I think that all of this should be put in the context of the backlash to weak European initiatives. So given all this complexity, I think it's important to understand that the West, and quote, Europe, appeared much like the Soviet system, but in different ways, to address gender equality and LGBTQ equality, but not in serious ways. And it's, I think, kind of that ambiguity, that unconscious ambiguity that has created the groundwork for the popularity of these anti-gender efforts. I'm thinking about something, and maybe y'all think this is kind of crazy, but I want to throw this out there. As I've been thinking about fascism, as I see Russia's invasion of Ukraine as fascist, among other things, that I've been thinking about the fact that, so my approach with Cataline and Mara has been to think consciously about ambiguity, and use ambiguity as an analytical lens to understand the communist approach to gender, but also understanding the post-communist approach, that we have to use our intersectional lens, we have to think about contradictory meanings and complexities, and that you can't make a simple answer to this question about whether communism was good or bad for women, and that part of the dynamics is thinking about those things. But to provide clarity for our students, But at the same time, it seems to me that fascism does the same thing, right? That famous definition of fascism is not just being ultranationalism, dictatorship, and racism, but fundamentally anti-logical, meaning like A and not A. It holds those two things at the same time. Russia says that we're ridding the Nazis. They're so happy they've got those soldiers from Mariupol. At the same time, Russia, to me, has embraced fascism over the last decade. So I'm kind of wondering if being more conscious about ambiguity can help us raise questions in new and interesting ways about the rise and attraction of these anti-gender efforts around the world. So that was my New York approach, doing it very, very quickly. I look forward to everybody's thoughts and questions.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Our final presentation is from Elżbieta. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, you can hear me now, I guess. Can you? Yes, okay, great. Thank you very much. I feel like I have learned already so much. My situation is slightly different because I don't work at the Center for East European Studies or the like. I work at the American Studies Center at Warsaw University. And this is the place where I mostly teach. And occasionally I also teach at other universities as a visiting scholar at Helsinki University or at Södertörn University, and recently also at Jena University. So that means that I have a very different audience and I have very different needs in a sense for my teaching. So it's so the courses I teach today are mostly focused on generally social movements and social change, populism and gender, and these are in a comparative perspective. So it usually includes different contexts by definition, and these courses are focused on understanding the dynamic of, for example, the emergence of anti-gender mobilizations, or the dynamics of culture wars, or the dynamics of the populist moment as a sort of moment in which certain issues are being expressed through, for example, culturalization of inequalities and the focus on gender. So this is a quite different situation from the one described by other speakers. Although I also taught, for example, courses in gender and women's movement in a transnational perspective, where I was happy to use the works by, for example, Susan Gall, who is, I think, here with us, by Maria Bukur, Birth of Citizenship, which is a wonderful book. And I think that the Routledge Handbook would be wonderful for this matter. I got my own copy here. Can you hear it? Or can you hear it? So it's really solid. I totally applaud you for doing this, because I know that it's been a lot of work and a lot of effort. So it's wonderful. But I think that what I wanted to focus today on is how do we employ those comparative lens if we talk about issues such as anti-gender mobilization or anti-gender movement and the broader trend of right-wing populism and right-wing extremism, or even fascism. Because of course each context has its specificity, but what I'm trying to usually include is the sort of broader geographical and also historical perspective of where those discussions, where those notions, where this language, this discourse comes from. So usually if I have a course now on anti-gender politics, I would start with, for example, discussing culture wars in the United States. I would start with discussing anti-communist movements in Latin America and how they sort of influenced the movement and how they sort of infused a specific type of neoliberalism, those who opposition to more liberal elements in the Catholic Church. I would also talk, of course, about the Vatican and its importance as both the producer of knowledge and discourse, but also as a semi-political institution of transnational importance. And of course, I would include gendered character of the democratization process in Central Eastern Europe, right? And then, of course, the rise of populism in contemporary Europe, the rise of extremism, how it is connected to neoliberalism, how it is connected to the broader political changes. And I would say my approach might be also a bit more interdisciplinary because of my own story. Because I've studied social psychology, then I've studied American culture, and then I moved towards sociology, and gender was always this kind of focal point for me to go through all those areas. But that means that I try to combine introducing concepts from political sociology or social movement studies, from gender studies, from cultural studies. So in that sense, I want my students to really have the map or of, to be able to navigate those discussions that they are embedded in their everyday lives, in the media, in everyday discussions, in the classroom, of course, and also give them a specific type of knowledge of the concepts and where they come from, what they mean, how they can be used. And in that sense, I would discuss, for example, populism and its sort of American and Russian roots. I would talk about social movement theory, especially like framing or political opportunities, so they would understand how this dynamic functions. But also we talk about emotions and affects in political communication, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, I try to design courses which are quite interdisciplinary in that sense, and they also, of course, usually gender studies are more interdisciplinary than many other fields, I would say, but in that sense, it might require people to really engage with different types of scholarship. But also, I think that when we talk about why do we do this, why do we teach and study anti-gender mobilizations or movement, my goal really, and also this connects to my sort of public engagements, because I do a lot of discussions, panels, opinion pieces, and so on, media engagements. I try to really provide people with the understanding of the connection between cultural processes and political ones, and also how their individual experiences and individual or context-specific issues are connected to broader processes, to sort of long-term histories of struggles around, for example, reproductive rights or sexual rights. So I want them to understand how issues such as moral panics or religious fundamentalism or online misogyny, how they function today, and why do we talk about them in a specific context. And usually I sort of connect to specific public debates, and I often use media pieces, I often use podcasts, or I often use the materials that are available online to make sure that they actually engage with those debates, to make sure that they're seeing that what we are doing in the classroom as part of being part of a broader discussion, which is connected to one thing which is, I think, incredibly important, and which I would like to discuss with you if you are also interested in that, because the issues that we are talking about, the anti-gender movement and the culture wars, however we want to sort of frame them, these are, the basic mechanism is the mechanism of polarization, right? The basic mechanism is to make the world black and white, to make sure, and I think that this is sort of the main feature of fascism, right? To establish a clear order and to actually work against the idea that ambiguity is something that we can or should accept. And I really love the idea of ambiguity as an analytical lens. So one of the things I started to do with my students is to try to get them to understand their, because most of the students I talk to are rather, I would say, liberal or progressive, and so on. So they would be very much into sort of seeing sort of the other side, the political opponents, as misinformed, as misguided, as cases of false consciousness, and so on and so forth. So I started to put quite a lot of effort into guiding them through the process of understanding others, basically, and their rationalities and their reasons for, being in the same, in a specific, having a specific position, right? So I often work with the book Strangers in Their Own Land, for example, to give them a sense of how can we do it, also in terms of a method, like what kind of research can give us this kind of deep insight into somebody else's life. Because I got really anxious when I understood that, I started to talk to my students and ask them about, people who oppose gender equality or people who oppose vaccinations, for example, like, do you think that you can talk to them? And the vast majority of students said, no, I cannot imagine myself even to actually talk to them. And I think that's why I try to introduce also concepts that would allow us to, to think about the conversation as something that is possible, conversation with people that we fundamentally disagree with on many issues. And that's why I often use research on right-wing movements, such as Kathleen Blee, for example, a pivotal work on Ku Klux Klan female supporters. And I think that we don't really have a lot of research on that. We really don't have much research on, what it is that actually, people who support specific, ideas that oppose gender equality, sexual rights, and so on, what their worldview is. So we are kind of stuck in this discussion about, culture versus economy, right? Is it because they're impoverished, or is it because they are racist and misogynist and tend to be misogynistic? So in that sense, I really try to work with this in my classes, and for that I also use oral histories, but also I found the works and podcasts by Professor Loretta Ross really interesting. She I don't know if you know her. She is a Black woman who worked with the people leaving Ku Klux Klan groups. And she's also an activist. And she tries to propose this idea of calling in instead of calling out. And I must say that my students, especially at the beginning, have been very opposed to this idea, and they were very resistant to that. So it took quite a lot of work to actually, start a discussion about that. And that's something that really is on my mind a lot during the last couple of years. How can we, as teachers, as those who produce knowledge and disseminate knowledge, alleviate this tendency towards polarization, especially since we are doing research on issues which evoke such strong feelings in ourselves, right? If you think about what's happening in Poland, or if we think about what's happening in the United States, for that matter, this is something that we strongly oppose, and we're also politically engaged, at least some of us, in this sphere. So this is something that I wanted to throw into discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was really fantastic. We have so much to talk about, and before I start with my own responses, I just first wanted to thank Misha and Roy for conceiving of this series of events. And of course, Maria, Janet, and Elżbieta for these comments. It's rare to include a session on pedagogy in conferences like these, and I think it was a really brilliant and important idea that they had to do this. So I've already learned a lot, and I'm happy to continue this conversation. I didn't come, into this with a preconceived set of questions. The questions I have really are just responding to the presentations we just heard, and the questions in some ways are as much to the panelists as to also the audience members. So sort of thinking about launching a broader discussion. And I don't want to go on too long, because I do want to give the audience a chance to raise the questions that they want to discuss. But I'll just pose a few, and then we'll give the panelists a chance to respond if they like, and then go to the audience for their questions and comments, which audience members should feel free to either raise their hands or put questions in the chat. I'll try and keep track of both of them. But the nice thing is that since this is a Zoom meeting rather than a webinar, you can actually pose your own questions, which is great. A lot of my questions actually are sort of taking themes that one or two of the panelists raised and sort of asking other panelists to reflect on them as well, because I think these are really interesting and important issues. Elżbieta talked a little bit in her presentation about how students respond to her teaching about anti-gender politics and populism. And I'd be interested in hearing from the other panelists as well as from the audience how students have responded to your teaching, what challenges you faced in terms of their responses. And that, I think, is really directly related to the question of different populations, which Maria raised right away, and Janet and Elżbieta also alluded to. Teaching students in Indiana versus New York City versus Poland is obviously very different. I think each of the panelists has addressed that to a certain extent, but I'd also love to hear more from audience members about the particular students that you teach and the challenges or opportunities or issues that arise from those different contexts. The third and fourth question I have, these are issues that also came up in each of the presentations, but I thought I'd love to hear more from other panelists or more from the audience, is kind of going to the issues of intersectionality. Janet explicitly mentioned the need to consider race in our discussions of anti-gender and anti-LGBTQ politics. I'm curious to hear from other panelists and audience members if or how you've been able to do that, as well as, I mean, I think in some ways we heard a bit more about anti-gender than anti-LGBTQ politics and pedagogy today, and so how you draw connections between those two, which are so obviously connected, but I don't know if that's always clear to students who may have sort of greater interest or investment in one form of politics or the other. Another question I had, and this is really kind of nuts and bolts, all of you offered great examples of readings and some primary sources as well, and I hope that we can collect those and maybe circulate them, because I found them really useful. I'm wondering if any of you have had particular success or luck with particular kinds of assignments in your courses related to these themes. We all tend to assign papers, but something I've been thinking about more in my own teaching is kind of how to broaden out the range of assignments that I offer to students. And then I have a question for those of you teaching history specifically. This is something I've thought about a lot. Each time I teach a survey course on East Central Europe since 1914, but really I tend to go from the late Austrian Empire to the present. And every time I teach it, I feel like I have to change it based on what's happening in the present. So I would be interested in hearing how recent anti-gender and populist politics globally, if it has changed the way you teach earlier periods, socialist and post-socialist history. And, relatedly, Janet alluded to this, but how very current events, including the war in Ukraine and the assault on reproductive rights in the United States and elsewhere, if that's shaped the conversations you're having with students, and if so, how. Elżbieta talked about COVID as something that's come into conversations, but you know, obviously when we start to talk about very more contemporary themes, students are even more likely to bring very current events into the classroom. That can also pose challenges in terms of how to manage discussion and disagreement. And that's also something I'm interested in hearing more about. So that was sort of a very broad range of questions, really just meant to spark continuing discussion. Would the panelists like to respond to any of those questions, or should we go right to the audience? I'm happy to do either.
I'd like to address the issue of intersectionality a little bit, if you don't mind.
Great.
And there's a lot going on in what you were asking, and I'm like, what do I pick? So this is not to challenge you, Tara, but to suggest that when we think about intersectionality, thinking about sexuality and relationship to gender is component of that. So when I talk about the anti-gender discussion, for me, that is very much about sexuality. It is very much about dealing with trans politics. It's very much about dealing with LGBTQ issues. I mean, so I challenged the heteronormative from the very first day that I entered the classroom in the way that we're using categories of analysis. And I try to push for a post-binary way of thinking through gender norms and rhetoric. And so that to me is the core of intersectionality, together with, of course, engaging with questions of race. The big issue, and I'm just going to leave aside my courses on gender because the population there is very different. And I think dealing with race there is front and center because of the way that students think about it now, frankly, very much at the front of their thinking about, you know, current gender norms in our country. But when I teach Eastern Europe, the question of race, of course, gets addressed a little differently, right? So we've heard from Janet about how she's dealing with that by talking about the Roma from her handbook. For me, the beginning of the conversation is about anti-Semitism very much, and the anti-Muslim attitudes that developed starting in the 18th, 19th century. So those are the things that I think of in terms of race, you know, and how I engage with them. And of course, talking about Roma is part of it as well, but it's not the only thing. It's kind of part of a larger set of specific challenges that have to do with the context itself, right? Since that those are all things that are in conversation with each other. So for me, in thinking about intersectionality, that's what I wanted to say, is that I always bring in both sexuality and race in conversation with each other. And the specific examples that I use very often, because students do understand this more, is the kind of ways in which, for instance, trans people in this country, you know, experience vulnerabilities and violence in a way that can only be understood intersectionally with regard to, for instance, the kind of huge statistics in terms of proportions, right, that Black trans women, you know, experience in relation to any other population in terms of sexual violence, right? Why is that the way it is one of the entry points for me with the students in thinking through our assumptions about basically bodily kind of, you know, sort of how we think of ourselves in a bodily sense as full humans, and to what extent our assumptions and the privilege that we walk in, being white, being, you know, not trans, most of us, you know, and being heterosexual, a lot of the people that I talk to, what does that mean in relation to the violence that a category of folks who are marked much more by violence experience? So that's the introduction to kind of thinking about intersectionality with them when I deal with anti-gender. And then we start moving into the more East European part, which they're less familiar with. And so that way they're brought into thinking about these issues intersectionally from something they know better to something that they know very little about.